Imagine this, you're in the 15th century, quietly minding your own linen. You stir your porridge clockwise, as one does, and then, God help you, you switch hands. Now most people might not notice, but Agnes does. Agnes always notices. She sees your ambidextrous stirring and gasps, as if you've summoned Beelzebub himself from the cauldron. Because in medieval Europe, using both hands with equal ease wasn't convenience, it was sorcery. You are now a suspect. Next thing you know, you're about to be hauled before the village elders, half of whom think Latin is a type of cheese, and the other half are just relieved it's not them this time. They ask you to demonstrate the stirring. You do. You use your left hand. Gasps ripple through the room like bad stew through a fragile stomach. You switch to your right. Someone drops their rosary. The priest crosses himself 3 times and demands you name your demon. You say you don't have one. They say that's exactly what a demon would say. Next thing you know, you're standing in the square with a pail on your head and a sign around your neck that says ambidextrous and unrepentant. Agnes nods solemnly. Justice, she believes, has been served. Then someone remembers you once hummed near a goat. The trial begins again. This time, the accusation is more serious. Intentional goat enchantment. The baker's cousin, who once saw a tapestry of a saint, claims goats are particularly susceptible to sound-based sorcery. No one knows what that means, but it sounds Latin, so it must be true. They ask you to recreate the hum. You decline. They take that as a confession. Next thing you know, you're standing in a puddle with a ring of salt around it, while the priest flips through a book that may or may not be upside down. A child is crying. Someone's dropped their loaf of rye and hasn't picked it up. The goat, by the way, is eating your hem. They poke you with a stick to see if you'll sing. You don't. The silence is suspicious. A woman named Marjorie faints dramatically and claims you once made her butter refuse to churn. You remind her it was February and she left the cream outside. She says that sounds like something a witch would know. Now they're arguing about whether humming counts as spell casting if it's out of tune. You stand there, damp, goat nibbled, wondering if maybe you should have joined that convent. Then a person notices your birthmark. It's small, irregular, harmless, but on a Tuesday in front of Agnes, under a sky that was already leaning toward judgment, it becomes fatal. They say it looks like a snake, or a rune, or a letter in a language no one speaks but everyone fears. You try to explain it's just a patch of skin. It came with you, like your left foot or your fear of geese. But they don't want to hear any of it. A needle is brought out. It's long and rusted. The priest blesses it. The steward drops it. They jab it into your mark. You flinch. Of course you do. They all nod. Next thing you know, you're sentenced. Quietly, efficiently, like ordering bread. There is no drama, no fire even. Just a rope, a beam. A murmured prayer to absolve those watching from the guilt they do not intend to feel. Agnes is already there. Of course she is. You are given a chance to confess, not to be spared, just so they can say you did. You decline. The crowd is polite in its horror. They do not cheer. They do not sob. They simply watch. As they always have. As they always will. And those weren't even the strangest reasons to be called a witch. It's the summer of 1487. The air smells like hot mud and boiled barley. The sheep are sweating in their wool, and the river's down to a sluggish trickle, thick with algae and the occasional dead thing. The village is quiet, not peaceful, just tired. Bread is hard, tempers are harder, and you have made a terrible mistake. You smell nice, not extravagantly so. No perfumes, no imported oils, just soap, real soap, the kind you make from rendered fat, wood ash, and crushed herbs. Lavender, maybe mint, a touch of chamomile if the goats haven't eaten it first. It's nothing special. It's just cleaner than most, and that's the problem. Because the others, they smell like people, like fear and mildew and hay that never quite dried, like stewed turnip and anxiety. You, on the other hand, smell faintly of flowers, which in a medieval village is the olfactory equivalent of dancing naked under the blood moon. They notice, first it's just whispers, a wrinkled nose, a sideways glance at the well. Someone asks what you're hiding. No one ever asks what you're washing with. The idea that you're clean is far more unsettling than the idea that you're cursed. It's the third week of summer, and your scent has become a problem. You don't notice at first. You've always added things to the washpot. Rosemary when it's dry, thyme when it isn't. It's not magic, it's just memory. Your grandmother did it. Her grandmother too. Women passed these tricks down like bruises and bread crusts, quietly, without ceremony. But now, the air around you lingers too sweet for comfort. Children say your house smells like the apothecary in the next town, the one that burned down last year in a suspicious blaze. A man whose ox limped through your cabbage patch says the scent is making his teeth ache. Your neighbour claims her goat has been acting strange ever since you walked by. It stared at her for a full minute, a clear sign of possession. You try to explain. You even offer to show them how you make it. The fat, the ash, the handfuls of crushed green. But they don't want to know the recipe. They want to know why you know it. That's the part they can't forgive. That a woman alone knows things. That she might know how to keep herself soft when the world is cracked and dry. That she smells like something other than suffering. They don't say witch yet, they say odd. They say off. They say not quite like the rest of us, but they're getting closer. The decision isn't made exactly. It settles, like soot after a fire, like fog that doesn't burn off by midday, like a smell, clinging, familiar, and unwanted. You feel it before anyone says a word, in the way people stop returning your greetings, in the way the priest averts his eyes when you pass, in the way a child is called sharply back from the path when you're approaching, though you've never so much as raised your voice. The judgment arrives in parts. First, the steward comes to your door. He doesn't knock. He coughs and waits, pretending his shoes are worth inspecting. You open it, because not opening the door is worse. He says he's here to ask a few questions about your soap, your herbs, your habits, about the time you walked home from the field and didn't take the usual path. You answer quietly. The less said, the better. He thanks you, doesn't look you in the eye, leaves a scuff on your threshold that won't quite scrub out. The next day, the boy from the mill claims he saw you pour something into the well. No one asks what, no one asks when, but now the village well has a taste. Iron, bitterness, fear. The day after that, someone swears they saw a cat on your roof. Not a black cat, not even your cat, just a cat, but on your roof, at dusk, and that's enough. By week's end, a verdict has been reached through silence. You are not accused, you are not charged, you are simply asked, would you come to the church? Would you answer a few more questions? Would you mind terribly stepping inside that little wooden room at the back? The one where the floor smells of damp straw and the bench is always cold. You know what this is? They're not seeking truth, they're seeking relief. A reason why the summer has soured, why milk spoils, why bread refuses to rise, why clean skin smells like arrogance. You step inside, you sit. Someone bolts the door behind you, gently, almost kindly. There's no echo. The walls are stuffed with old straw, meant to muffle sound, or perhaps absorb it. There's no fire either, just the breath of summer heat curling through the seams in the wood. It smells of mildew and dust and something sharp beneath it, like boiled vinegar or old sweat. No one speaks for a long time. You sit with your back straight, your hands folded in your lap, trying not to remember your grandmother's voice, trying not to think of the last time Someone was brought to this room and didn't return through the front door. Eventually, the door creaks again. Someone enters, not a judge, not a steward, a deacon, young, uncertain, his robe too clean, his boots too new. He doesn't look at you directly. He holds a piece of parchment that shakes slightly in his grip. He reads from it, your name, your dwelling, your habits. It is not a list of crimes. It is a list of traits. You live alone. You gather herbs. You boil your water before drinking it. You do not attend every feast day. You smell unreasonably pleasant. He asks if you've ever been ill. You say yes. He asks if you've ever been cured. You say also yes. He frowns. He wasn't trained for that. Then comes the real question. Have you ever made something that worked when prayer did not? You pause. That, you know, is the hinge on which all of this turns. You say you've boiled willow bark for pain. That's not magic, you say. That's common sense. He nods like he's heard those exact words before and has been told what they really mean. Then he asks about the scent, that impossible suspicious scent, like marigolds and sage and something cleaner than any woman has a right to be. You tell them it's soap. Fat, ash, mint if it's in season. Thyme if the goats haven't got into it first. Sometimes chamomile. You say it plainly, like someone describing weather. You've done nothing wrong, and wrongness is what they're after, not logic. They nod, then frown, then look to the priest. He asks if you dreamed the recipe. You blink. He asks again, more slowly, as if you didn't understand the first time. Did it come to you in a dream? A voice? A shadow? A whisper in the hedge? You say no. You say your grandmother taught you. You say it's practical, keeps flies off the skin, keeps lice away, helps with the boils. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters, boils are from God. They ask what else you make. You say broth, vinegar tinctures, a salve for cracked heels. They ask what it's made of. You tell them. They ask what else it's made of. You don't understand the question. They seem disappointed by that. The deacon, still standing by the door, asks softly if you've ever used these mixtures for other purposes. His tone suggests he wants you to say yes, not out of cruelty, out of eagerness, as if he's been waiting for this. A break in the script, a turn in the story. You say no. He sighs. They change tactics. They say a child has fallen ill, that the baker's daughter woke in a fever and spoke of flowers, that her bed smelled faintly of lavender, that her mother swore she hadn't put anything in the room. No herbs, no sachets, nothing. You say nothing. They say the scent was yours. You still say nothing. The priest, emboldened now, says the devil doesn't always burn. Sometimes he smells sweet. Sometimes temptation isn't red and spiked, but soft and perfumed and quiet. He says, you've made people comfortable in the wrong way. That suffering is sacred. That soap is, in its way, a kind of rebellion, a refusal to carry the weight everyone else has agreed upon. You ask if cleanliness is now a sin. No one answers. Instead, they step back. The door creaks open. The smell of the church, wax and mildew and cold stone, rushes in to replace your own. You are told to leave. You are told they'll speak with you again. Soon. It's cooler when you step outside, though the air hasn't changed. It's just that something has left you, or been taken. You're not sure which. The square is nearly empty. One old man tends to a broken cartwheel. A dog scratches itself against the chapel steps. No one looks at you. No one speaks. You walk home the long way, past the hedgerow, past the field where the barley failed last year. The scent of crushed mint rises from your sleeves. You think about rubbing dirt into your skin. You think about bathing in the stream until it's gone. But it wouldn't matter. They'd say the river was bewitched. They'd say the dirt smelled strange. There's no direction to turn in that doesn't end at the same point. At home, everything is where you left it. The pot on the hook, The bundle of dried lemon balm, the cat asleep on the windowsill, unaware it may soon be described as a familiar. You don't eat, you don't sleep, you wait. The next day someone knocks. No one bolts the door this time. No whispered questions, no deacon. It's the reeve and 4 others. They do not enter, they tell you plainly. There's been a decision, not a trial. That's too formal, not an execution. That's too final. They say you're to be removed, that the village must be protected. That cleanliness is no longer persuasive evidence of innocence. You ask what they'll say afterward. They look confused. You ask again, what story will they tell? They say there won't need to be one. The smell alone was enough. They say a woman who smells like flowers in a summer of rot is already halfway to the gallows. You're not bound. They don't need to. You walk with them. Past the well, past the chapel, past the woman who once asked you for the same soap she now denounces. In the end, there is no rope. There is water. They've chosen the river. You're told to confess, not to save your soul, but to ease their own. You say nothing. The priest holds out a cross. You do not touch it. They push. The water is warm, slow, not deep enough to matter. You do not float. You do not fight. The last thing you smell is rosemary, crushed beneath the heel of someone trying not to watch. They leave in silence, boots wet, robes clinging at the hems. One man trips on a root and curses under his breath, then crosses himself, because cursing near the drowned is bad luck. The priest lingers longest, staring at the water, as if it might erase what's just happened or rewrite it with gentler hands. It doesn't. By the time they return to the village, the sun has shifted. The baker's wife is sweeping her step. The blacksmith is drinking something too strong for the hour. No one asks what happened. They already know. They don't say your name. Names belong to the living. That night it rains. Not much. Just enough to turn the dust to paste. Just enough to make the wooden cross at the church lean 1 degree further into the soil. The scent of lavender clings to the air for one last time. Sharp, soft, out of place. In the days that follow, things return to normal. As normal as they ever were. The bread still won't rise. The well still tastes of metal. The baby's fever breaks, but he grows quiet, doesn't smile. The baker's wife lights more candles than usual. Your house stands empty. Some children dare each other to peer inside. One swears she heard humming. Another says the cat still sleeps there, curled on the bed that smells like herbs and ghosts. A third claims he saw a figure by the window. No one believes him, not officially. The roof begins to sag. Eventually, someone takes the house. A woman with 4 children and a husband who doesn't come home often. She scrubs the walls with vinegar. She buries the soap. She replaces the linens. She boils lye until the scent chokes the air. But in spring, the mint comes back, uninvited, unasked for. It grows wild beneath the window. No one pulls it. It grows in silence, mint thick and low, winding through the broken stones, like it's remembering something. No one planted it. No one claims it. But there it is, green and stubborn, scenting the breeze just enough to be noticed, just enough to be familiar. The new tenant avoids it. She says it gives her headaches. Her oldest daughter, 8 or 9, already too cautious for her age, sits beside it sometimes, watching bees. Once she picks a stem and crushes it between her fingers. She smells it. She smiles. Then she hides the leaf in her pocket and doesn't tell her mother. By midsummer, the plant has spread. It climbs the threshold. It pushes through the cracks in the window frame. It coils up around the edge of the hearth, where the old stones still hold a shadow of warmth. The villagers don't speak of you, but they notice. A woman scrubs her arms, harder at the well after walking past your cottage. A man spits when he smells lemon balm on the wind. The priest burns extra incense on feast days, muttering louder, as if louder Latin can drown out memory. Still the herbs grow. Lavender, faint and woody. Sage, silver and low to the earth. Marigold, golden against the gloom. Each season brings more. Your old garden blooms as if it was promised something. They consider pulling it all up, starting fresh, cleansing the land. But every time someone volunteers, something comes up. A lame foot, a sick cow, rain, too much bread to bake, too little time. Eventually, they simply avoid it. Your cottage becomes a boundary, not a place they walk around, a place they don't mention when they map out fields or plan harvest feasts. It's not cursed exactly, it's just yours, even now. Children grow up hearing the story, though no one quite tells it the same way. Some say you danced with the devil. Others say you could speak to animals. One boy insists you turned into mist. His sister says you simply washed too often, and the village couldn't stand it. The truth gets quieter each year, but the scent lingers. On foggy mornings, it wafts down the path from your door to the chapel. On certain nights, if the wind is right, it sneaks into the priest's chambers, and he wakes choking on rosemary. No one sleeps well when the mint is flowering. One day, a girl comes to the garden, not the girl with the pocketed leaf. Her daughter, or perhaps her granddaughter, it doesn't matter. She kneels in the dirt. She touches the thyme. She tucks a sprig behind her ear. She stays there until dusk, saying nothing. Then she stands, dusts off her skirt, and walks back into the village, smelling like something old, something unwelcome, something remembered. And as she disappears down the path, a crow takes flight from the chimney and circles once, twice, before vanishing into the grey sky. The village braces for a summer of strange weather. They've seen this before. It begins again, as these things always do. Not with thunder, not with flame, but with a whisper. Not even a full sentence, just a murmur in the market between turnips and tired hands. Did you smell it? That's all it takes. The girl returns the next day. And the next. She carries no basket. She picks nothing. She only sits, listens. Sometimes she speaks, but not loudly, not in ways others can hear. A man says he saw her lips moving with no one near. A woman says the bees land on her skin without stinging. A child says her breath smells like violets, and her eyes look like the well water right before a storm. Someone asks her name. She doesn't answer. Someone else remembers your name, or part of it, or the shape of it. They say it slowly, like tasting old stew. Familiar, but sour. No one writes it down. No one ever did. A few villagers try to approach the garden, now half wild and teeming. They say it hums. They say the scent clings to them for hours after. They say their dreams are strange now, that they wake remembering songs they've never learned. The priest visits once, just once. He carries incense and a jug of holy water. He stands at the edge, mutters scripture, and sprinkles the first few feet of dirt. Nothing burns, nothing hisses. The plants sway indifferent. He does not step further in. That night, he is heard sobbing behind the chapel wall. The next morning, he claims the wind overturned a candle. That's why the altar cloth is scorched. No one asks what happened to his left hand. No one asks why he smells faintly of crushed mint. The girl continues to visit, and slowly, as if pulled by thread, others begin to follow. Not openly, not in groups, alone, quiet, curious. A mother with a sick child sits by the hedge and doesn't speak. A shepherd places a broken lamb on the path and returns the next day to find it missing, and a tuft of rosemary where it had lain. A widower begins leaving small pieces of bread near the stones. He never says why. The village is divided, though no one admits it. Some still say it's witchcraft. Others call it old wisdom. The young call it something else entirely, though they don't share the word. They just look toward the garden and feel something ancient shift behind their ribs. And in the house, which no one dares claim, the shutters stay closed, though the wind never rattles them. Not anymore. The girl does not move in. She doesn't need to. It's already hers. And when she stands one morning, sprigs in her braid, soil in her fingernails, and begins to walk the path toward the village well, not one person stops her. They watch, they listen, they remember. The well hasn't drawn clean in months. The bucket comes up tinged with rust or something like it, cloudy and sour, with a smell that clings to the hands and leaves stains on linens no matter how long they boil. No one drinks from it now, unless they have to. The children are sent up river with jugs. The priest has taken to blessing the water twice before Mass. It hasn't helped. So when the girl walks toward it, alone, barefoot, still damp with the morning dew, it's not just curiosity that draws the villagers out behind their shutters. It's hope, or something shaped like it. She does not speak. She does not pray. She kneels beside the stone lip, places her hands on the moss-soft edge, and simply waits. The air shifts. The square grows still. Some say the wind stops. Others say it starts. No one agrees, only that something passes through the place, unseen and vast and very old, like breath, like memory. The girl leans over the well, not far, just enough to see her reflection. It looks back. A ripple moves across the surface, not wind, not a stone, just movement, the kind water makes when it recognises something it's seen before. The girl dips her fingers into it, pulls them back, smells them. Lavender. No one speaks, not even the birds. A few of the older women cross themselves, but they do it out of habit, not fear. The fear has dulled into something quieter, something like awe. Someone steps forward, an old man with a crooked leg and a crooked heart. He asks if it's safe. The girl turns to him. She smiles. No words. Just the scent of mint and something golden and lost. He kneels. He drinks. He does not die. And just like that, the spell, or the fear of one, breaks. A crowd forms, hesitant and lopsided. No one pushes. No one demands. They wait their turn. They whisper. The girl steps back. She walks to the edge of the square. She doesn't look behind her. She returns to the house. By dusk the well runs sweet again, and the garden, your garden, blooms deeper, wilder, fuller than it ever did while you lived. As if something in the soil has finally exhaled. No one calls her a witch, not out loud, but they remember yours. They speak of you now in low voices, not with fear, but with care. They say your name again, softly, wrongly, reverently. They light a candle on your old hearth, now cleaned and kept warm. They press herbs into the rafters, like offerings. They breathe deeply. The girl stays. The village oddly softens. And the crow, it comes back. It doesn't land. It just circles. Once, twice, then disappears into the dusk. By autumn, no one questions it anymore. The girl is part of the rhythm now, like smoke from the chimneys, like frost on the grass, like the hush that settles over the village when dusk slips in behind the hills. She tends your garden with quiet hands. She doesn't speak unless spoken to. She watches the sky more than most. And the garden, oh the garden, it feeds more than it should. The rosemary thrives into winter. The sage bursts thick and silver. The mint refuses to die. Things grow there that should not, at times, they should not. And no one tries to stop it. Some bring their ailments to her. A boil, a weeping eye, a child who won't stop crying at night. She listens. She nods. She hands them a pouch or a cup or a scrap of folded cloth. She never says what it is. She never charges. They never ask. The priest watches all of this with the silence of a man who no longer trusts his vocabulary. He preaches louder now. His sermons speak of humility, of obedience, of keeping to one's place. He no longer mentions the devil. It's too close to naming, too close to memory. He burns more incense. It doesn't help. People still go to church, but some begin stopping by the garden first. By winter, the stories change. They no longer say you smell too sweet. They say the village was sick and didn't know it. They say you carried medicine the way others carried baskets, quietly, with purpose. That you tried to offer it, that you tried to teach, that we weren't ready. They don't say witch anymore. They say wronged. A woman hangs a sprig of lavender over her child's cradle. A boy ties mint to his boots for luck in the fields. An old man carves your name into the back of a spoon. None of them speak of it in the square. But when the wind shifts and the crows gather near the chapel roof, everyone looks to your garden. And when the girl kneels among the rosemary, humming something low and strange and half forgotten, no one interrupts. Not anymore. Because now, when someone asks, "Did you smell that?" they don't say it with fear. They say it with hope. Spring comes early. It slips into the village without ceremony, softening the ground and loosening the frost from the chapel stones. Snow melts into silence. Trees bud like they're testing a rumour. The river runs clearer than anyone remembers. The girl is still there, tending the garden. She doesn't change with the seasons. She layers wool when it's cold, loosens it when it's warm. But otherwise, she remains as she was. Quiet, barefoot, herb-scented. People start planting their own gardens again. Not because they need to, but because they want to. They ask her nothing, and she offers nothing. But somehow their cabbages sprout straighter, their carrots sweeter. A boy insists his hen started laying more eggs after he left a sprig of marigold by the roost. No one laughs. A travelling merchant passes through one morning, selling pins and prayer scrolls. He hears a tale about the garden girl and scoffs loud enough for the baker to hear. By evening he has a rash on both arms and a horse that won't look at him. He leaves before dawn. The girl never acknowledges it. No one asks if she had anything to do with it. But the baker leaves a basket of oatcakes at her gate the next morning, just in case. You're spoken of more often now, not just by the old women, the younger ones too. They say your name when they stir soup, when they rub a tincture on a child's chest, when they smell rosemary at the edge of sleep. Your name, once forbidden, becomes a charm. They say it softly, like prayer, like apology. No one remembers the names of the men who questioned you. Not really. The reeve died last winter. The deacon moved inland. The priest still lives, but he keeps to himself. And no one goes to confession anymore. They say repentance is for the living. And you are more present now than you ever were alive. Children grow up hearing your story, half wrong and half wonderful. They mix facts with folklore. They say your spirit lives in the mint. They say your cat never left. They say the river gave you back to the earth, not as punishment, but as seed. In time they build a bench by the garden. Just a bench, no plaque, no marker. People sit there when they're tired, when they're worried, when they don't know what to do and need to feel close to something older than fear. And on certain mornings, when the dew clings low and the crows line the fence like watchmen, the scent of lavender moves through the village like breath. No one questions it. They breathe it in. They carry it home. And that's how you leave your legacy. Witchcraft was never just about belief. It was a structure, a system of social control built from rumour and ritual. A woman who could ease pain without a priest's blessing was not miraculous. She was dangerous because she offered comfort outside the approved channels, because she soothed the world's hurt in ways no man could explain. And what cannot be explained must be punished. The law didn't need evidence. It needed consensus. Enough neighbours whispering in the same direction. Enough frightened faces nodding at the same time. That was a trial. That was all it took. You could be denounced in the street, at the well, while buying flour. A moment of bad luck, and suddenly your kindness to a sick child last week looks like cause. You gave her a clove-studded orange to hold. You meant it as comfort. But when the fever took her anyway, the fruit was burned in the hearth, and your name was ash in the priest's mouth. The earliest records show that it was never really about spells. The medieval church didn't even fully believe in magic. At first they said witches were merely deluded, that Satan had tricked them into thinking they flew or cursed or transformed, that their sins were spiritual, not supernatural. But as famine deepened and plague clawed through town after town, theology grew teeth. The devil stopped being metaphor. He became a contract. Witches were no longer foolish. They were criminal. They were no longer led astray. They were collaborators. It was a clever twist. A woman accused of being misled by temptation could be forgiven. But a woman accused of signing her name in the devil's book, she could only be extinguished. And so the fire began. Inquisitors were dispatched, first in small numbers. Then as fear spread, more. They carried books that described the signs of a witch. A too smooth patch of skin. A habit of speaking to birds. A fondness for night walks. They asked questions that had no safe answers. Do you have dreams? Have you ever felt angry at a neighbour? Have you spoken words you did not understand? If you said yes, you were marked. If you said no, you were lying. If you hesitated, they already had their proof. Torture was sanctioned not to punish, but to extract truth. Truth being defined as whatever fit the shape of the question. They called it examination. They wrote down every word. Even screams became confession. The woman who cried loudest was said to be resisting. The one who stayed silent had made a pact. There was no clean way out. Once accused, you had already left the world of the living. The best you could do was name others. Some did, not because they believed, but because naming someone else bought you time. It delayed your trial. It made you useful. You became a tool, not a target, but only for a while. The list always came back around. The devil's book, they said, had many names in it, and so they filled their own. They believed witches gathered at night, in secret places where the trees leaned in too closely, and the air smelled like earth left too long in darkness. These meetings, they claimed, were called Sabbaths, unholy ceremonies, where witches feasted on the flesh of infants, danced backward, mocked the holy rites, and kissed the devil in unspeakable places. None of it was true, but it was written down in ink, repeated in pulpits, whispered into the ears of trembling townsfolk, until it became doctrine. The authorities collected testimonies from women, too exhausted to resist, too broken to protest, too mutilated by questioning to remember their own names. These women would say anything, and everything they said became another chapter in the growing myth. The image of the witch changed, slowly but surely. She was no longer just the old widow who gathered mushrooms or the midwife who brewed teas to ease pain. She became monstrous. She flew. She transformed. She cursed. She could sour milk with a glare, cause miscarriages with a thought, steal a man's virility just by walking past his barn at the wrong hour. Her body was unnatural, her soul forfeit, and her power, her imagined power, was irresistible to those who feared how little they controlled in the real world. Witchcraft became a useful diagnosis for whatever unsettled society. A harvest failed? Witches. A nobleman's wife miscarried? Witches. A town suffered fire, plague, or flood. The devil had walked among them, and surely he hadn't come alone. Every unexplained tragedy demanded a narrative, and witchcraft offered one with convenient targets. People were more willing to accept suffering if they believed it had a cause, especially one they could burn. It wasn't only women. Men were accused too: hermits, healers, midwives' husbands, the odd shepherd who spent too much time with his animals. But it was mostly women, and within that, mostly the poor, the old, the childless, the ones without brothers or husbands to speak on their behalf, the ones who brewed instead of buying, the ones who bled in silence and aged without ceremony. Some tried to defend them. A few brave voices in the church insisted that witches weren't real, that God did not allow such power to fall into mortal hands. But they were shouted down by the louder voices, the more frightened ones, the ones who found comfort in cruelty disguised as caution. And the tools of their trade were humble things: a broom for sweeping, a pot for boiling roots, a cat for company, a red ribbon, a bit of string. These became emblems of unholy allegiance. If your apron was stained with strange powders, it wasn't flour, it was sorcery. If you had herbs hanging from your ceiling, it wasn't seasoning, it was seduction. If your home smelled of flowers in winter, the devil had warmed it. It didn't take much. A song hummed under breath, a child cured too quickly, a look held too long. Some places were worse than others. In southern Germany, the trials burned hottest. Town after town, the flames climbed higher, fed by panic and protocol. The prince-bishops of Würzburg and Bamberg oversaw thousands of executions in the 1620s alone. Entire families swallowed in suspicion. Children were tortured into naming their mothers. Mothers named neighbours just to make it stop. Sometimes it didn't even begin with a death. It began with weather. A hailstorm, a failed crop, a single crow flying overhead too slowly. From there, the questions asked themselves. In Scotland, the trials were colder, but no less cruel. The Scots favoured sleep deprivation. Let a woman sit without rest, without food, with her ankles bound in iron, for days at a time. Let her wake in gasps. Let her forget where she is, what's real, whether the thoughts in her mouth are hers or given. Then ask her if she danced with the devil. She will say yes, anyone would. In France, in Normandy, in the Pyrenees, the same patterns repeated. A woman on the edge of town. A sickness that would not leave. A magistrate eager to please his superiors. The records vary in detail, but never in outcome. Even in England, where fewer witches were killed than on the continent, the machinery remained intact. Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general, operated in the 1640s like a plague on two legs. He travelled from town to town, offering his services, his questions, his pins and his trial by water. He was not sanctioned by Parliament. That didn't matter. He was paid. One of his most infamous tests was simple. Throw a woman into water. If she floated, she was a witch, rejected by the water, an unnatural body. If she sank, she was innocent. Of course, the water did not care. It was cold and deep and indifferent. Women died proving their innocence every week. Witch trials weren't spontaneous. They were structured. They were bureaucratic. They followed paperwork, protocols, fees. You could buy immunity with the right coin. You could lose your life over a whisper if your debts weren't paid. The Malleus Maleficarum, a book written in 1487 by two inquisitors, became the manual. It spread like disease across Europe, reprinted dozens of times. Its message was clear. Women are weaker, more carnal, more inclined to evil. Witches are real. They must be destroyed. And those who doubt it, they're suspect too. Its impact was devastating. It codified what had already taken root in the minds of many, that a woman's independence was dangerous, her knowledge suspect, her suffering inevitable. And the devil? He needed no introduction. He was always waiting, at the crossroads, at the hearth, behind a perfectly clean doorstep, because the real terror was never in the spell. It was in the idea that someone like you could change things, heal someone, feed someone, live too long, smile too often, smell too sweet. That was the real magic, and they could not allow it. Witchcraft was also local. What made you a witch in one region might not raise an eyebrow in another. In England, toads were suspect. In Italy, dreams. In Finland, it was weatherworking, being able to call or calm the wind, often by tying knots in string. 3 knots, they said. 1 for a breeze, 1 for a gale, and 1 for a storm strong enough to break a ship in 2. Sailors paid good money for those knots. They feared them even as they sought them. The logic of fear was never consistent. It didn't need to be. In Iceland, they hunted men more than women. A reversal of the usual pattern. Their magic was tied to runes, to grimoires copied in secret. A shepherd might be killed for carrying a scroll with charms against wolves, a boy for reciting the wrong verse near a churchyard. Witches there did not fly on broomsticks. They rode the wind in sealskin cloaks. They whispered to ravens. They spoke the old words in a land that did not forget easily. In rural France, witches were believed to shapeshift, into hares mostly, into black dogs or owls. The line between fairy tale and accusation blurred so fully that children grew up unsure which was more dangerous, the witch or the story about her, and in truth it didn't matter. Once named, a witch could never go unnamed. The signs of witchcraft were endless and contradictory. Did you have a birthmark? A mole? That was one sign. Did you not have one? That was another. Did you talk to yourself while sweeping? Did you fail to cry at a funeral? Did you cry too much? Were you seen gathering wood at dusk, or praying alone, or eating when others fasted, or fasting when others feasted? Each answer was a snare, and the punishment always was the same. Whether you had cursed the crops or merely survived too long, the outcome was assured. You were tied, you were judged, you were erased, not just in body, in memory, in record, in ritual. Many accused witches were never written down. Their names are gone, lost in ash and rumour, and fields replanted. Sometimes all that remains is a note in the margins of a court ledger. 1 woman burned, or a certain midwife drowned. No name, no age, just the fact of removal. Some weren't even removed. They were warned, banished, made to live alone and die slowly, which was cheaper and less theatrical, but just as final. If they ever returned, it was only in stories. The hag in the woods, the crone with the crooked nose, the one who smells of nettles and whispers in the trees. But she had a name once. She had a home. She had hands that soothed fevered children and braided herbs and folded dough, and a village that chose to forget her. Eventually, laws changed. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 made it illegal to accuse someone of actual magical power. Not because Parliament had become more compassionate, but because they decided witchcraft wasn't real. Pretending to be a witch was now a crime. Being called one was not. The Inquisition moved on. The church found new enemies. Science grew teeth. Disease began to make sense under microscopes. The weather was explained by pressure, not possession. Slowly, the reasons to fear old women and scented soap fell out of fashion, but the scars remained. Communities that had once torn themselves apart with accusations didn't always recover. A village that had burned a dozen women could never quite look at itself the same way again. So it didn't. It forgot. It buried the trials in silence, covered the ashes with new crops, and taught the children only part of the story. And yet, the witch never left. She remained in stories reimagined. A caution, then a joke, then a symbol. Fairy tales gave her crooked hats and candy houses. Halloween gave her black cats and plastic noses. The same culture that once hanged her now sells her image on greeting cards. But underneath all that, the original fear still lingers. The fear of a woman who knows too much. The fear of someone who does not beg. The fear of the wrong kind of power. Quiet, herbal, unblessed. And the memory of those who were never witches, not really, but were treated as though they were, still hums beneath the soil of the old villages, in the places where the mint grows wild and uninvited, where the wind changes suddenly, where the crows still circle, once, twice, then vanish. Their names are mostly lost, but their stories, no matter how they tried, were never quite erased. Some names survived. Isabel Goody from Scotland confessed freely and in vivid detail. She said she rode on rush stalks through the night, met the Queen of Elfhammer beneath the hill, turned into a hare with a rhyme. Her words were recorded in 1662, not with horror, but fascination. No one knows if she was tortured. She may have been mad, or clever, or simply exhausted. Her confession read like folklore. They hanged her anyway. Then there was Alice Kyteler of Kilkenny Island, tried in 1324. Wealthy, outspoken, and married 4 times. 3 husbands died, and 1 grew strangely ill. Her servant, Petronilla, was tortured into confession. Alice fled. Petronilla was burned. It was the first recorded witch execution in Ireland. Alice was never seen again. In Germany, Anna Goldie was executed in 1782, often called the last witch killed in Europe. She worked as a maid. Her employer's daughter began spitting pins. They blamed Anna. She was tortured, then beheaded. Officially, she was tried for poisoning. Unofficially, everyone knew the word they meant was witch. Each of them was real. Their stories were written down, their sentences passed, their bodies taken, their memories distorted. Most left no names behind, no grave, just a village a little emptier, a field a little quieter. We now cross a quieter boundary, one not marked by fire, but by ink and suspicion, by books bound in skin and spells murmured beneath breath. Wizards, cunning men, magicians, alchemists, sorcerers. In the medieval world, they did not hang the same way witches did, but they were watched. And sometimes when the wind shifted and the mood soured, they burned too. Here begins a slow and careful descent into the history of the medieval wizard. A 20-part, immersive, richly textured sleep lecture, dry, calm and faintly unsettling. Educational in tone, lullaby in rhythm. Let us begin. It is the autumn of 1352. The sky's low, and the light filters through smoke from 100 hearths, clinging to the village like old breath. Your neighbour says her cow is giving milk too early. The steward's son has a rash no poultice will cure. Someone mentions a name, softly, behind the bakery, while no one is listening too closely. Not a woman's name, a man's. He lives beyond the tree line. He has books. He owns a compass and a quill made of crow feather. Once, during a storm, he walked calmly through the rain and did not get wet. A wizard, they say, or something close to it. They say it the way one might say wolf, or thief, or saint, because medieval magic had many names, and not all of them meant death. Not right away. He is not called a witch, not exactly. That word is for women, for midwives, for widows, for the wrong kind of silence. When a man is accused of magic, they use other words. Cunning man, wise man, charmer, sorcerer, alchemist, magician, master of hidden arts. It depends on the town, the language, the season, the political mood. He is less feared than a witch, though not entirely safe. He is tolerated if he's useful, if he sets a broken limb when the village bone setter is drunk, if he finds lost cattle, if he says a prayer that keeps the lightning away, so long as he doesn't ask too many questions or write down too much. Literacy is a fragile kind of power in the 14th century. Books are rare, Ink is expensive. Parchment takes skin, real skin, scraped and treated. To own more than a psalter or a calendar is to admit to a certain kind of privilege. To have a book not written by a monk? That's something else altogether. That's foreign. Possibly Moorish, possibly worse. Many wizards of the time are autodidacts, self-taught from scraps, from oral tradition, from fragments of Aristotle and Galen, from grimoires copied so many times their margins are made of errors. Others are clerics, halfway between divine and damned. Some are university men, trained in Latin, who move numbers around with ink and call it invocation. They learn from the old texts, the Picatrix, the Key of Solomon, the Secretum Secretorum. They believe in correspondences, in humours, in planets that govern fate. They think metals grow like fruit inside the earth, slowly ripening from lead to gold. They map stars not for wonder, but for medicine. They call this alchemy, and they call it science. The line between wizard and philosopher is thin and sometimes invented. A wizard, if clever, can claim he is only studying the world. He builds astrolabes, not amulets. He distills wine, not potions. He calculates angles, not spirits. But the suspicion remains, because his tools are quiet, because his work is solitary, because he has answers that don't begin with scripture. And sometimes because his answers work, the church does not always know what to do with such men. They are too educated to burn, too useful to imprison, too unpredictable to trust, so they are watched. And as long as they speak carefully, as long as their results don't frighten anyone too much, they are allowed to keep speaking, until the wind changes. Sometimes they call themselves philosophers, not because they ponder the meaning of life, but because it sounds better than sorcerer. Because philosophy, properly dressed in Latin and veiled with Aristotle, offers a kind of shelter. You can say you're studying natural causes. You can say your powders and your flames and your celestial charts are simply tools to understand the divine order of things. You do not say you're trying to control them, but everyone understands that you are. The wizard is different from the village witch, not just in gender, but in method. His tools are not wooden spoons and garlic strings, but measuring rods, burning glasses, alembics, and brass instruments. He speaks not in whispers, but in diagrams. He does not brew for healing. He distills for truth. He might still cure, but only incidentally. His work is aimed higher. He wants to transmute, to summon, to see beyond. Some attempt to create life, homunculi shaped in flasks, fed on blood and incantation. Others seek angels, spirits, intelligences of the fixed stars. They believe that if the right name is spoken, and the right stone is engraved, and the right herb is burned beneath the right moon, the heavens will answer. It is a kind of prayer, but without a church, and that is what makes them dangerous. Because wizardry is not inherited, it is learned. A witch, they say, is chosen by the devil. But a wizard chooses himself. He studies, he experiments, he accumulates power not by pact but by practice. And that, in a world built on hierarchy, is deeply threatening. Because if knowledge is power, and power can be written in books, then power is transferable, which means it can be stolen, which means it must be contained. So kings consult their astrologers in secret and ban them in public. Popes write treatises against necromancy while commissioning star charts for their journeys. The same man who is imprisoned in Florence for conjuring demons might be paid in Paris for calculating eclipses. It depends always on the mood of the moment, on whether the wizard's knowledge is seen as a threat to God or simply a poor imitation. Some wizards work from towers, work from tall, round, stone-thick places that smell of wax and rust, perched on cliffs, or buried in monastic corners, where the candles burn low and no one asks too many questions. Others work in basements, behind trapdoors, under taverns, in the cold cellars of universities, surrounded by stacks of parchment, boxes of minerals, and jars labelled with scripts no one dares to translate. Their spaces are cluttered but ordered. Every object has meaning, even the broken ones. They keep animals, not for sacrifice, not usually, but for observation. Frogs, toads, beetles in boxes, cats, though always with some superstition attached. Some believe a cat will warn of a bad spirit. Others believe a cat is one. They speak in tongues, Latin mostly, sometimes Greek, occasionally Arabic, borrowed from older, wiser texts, passed across the Mediterranean through Moorish Spain, where the libraries were older than the Crusaders and thicker than the Gospel. The wizard does not care where knowledge comes from, only that it comes. He draws circles, he recites names, he burns sulphur and salt and powdered rose petals. Sometimes it works, most of the time it does not. Failure is expected. Failure is part of the process. Success is something else entirely. When something does happen, when a door moves that should not, or a glass vial glows with no fire beneath it, it is written down quickly, in cramped ink and trembling shorthand. Not always because it is miraculous, often because it is terrifying. No wizard ever trusts his results, because wizardry is not just about knowing, it is about not knowing and proceeding anyway. That is what separates the charlatan from the true practitioner. The charlatan seeks applause, the wizard seeks patterns, and the world is full of patterns, in the shapes of fern leaves, in the cracks in tortoiseshell, in the sky when Venus rises before dawn. To a wizard, the world is not random, it is a code, and with enough time and enough caution and enough suffering, it can be read. But the cost of reading is high. Many go mad, not from demons, from the silence, from the long hours, from the creeping sense that the universe is speaking, and they may never fully understand what it's trying to say. The word wizard was dangerous. It suggested pride, and pride was a sin. Better to be called a philosopher or a student of nature. Better to let others name your work while you spoke in safer terms. Virtus, influentia, causa occulta, hidden causes, subtle forces. They were always just on the edge of what the church could tolerate. Many were clerics themselves, tonsured men with ink-stained fingers, tucked into monasteries with access to rare texts. They copied Pliny, Galen, Ptolemy, but also the Liber Hermetis, the Ars Notoria, the Book of Secrets. It was easy at first to pass these works off as curiosities, but the more they experimented, the more they saw patterns the scriptures did not explain, and they asked questions the Gospels could not answer. This is where wizardry becomes dangerous, not because it summoned devils, but because it competed with theology. What is fate if not a chain of planetary forces? What is sin if not imbalance in the humours? What is the soul if not a kind of heat? Wizards did not always seek to replace religion. Many were devout, but in their notebooks and secret lectures they built parallel systems of meaning, worlds where power came not from prayer, but from understanding. And the church noticed. The Dominican inquisitors who wrote most about witches also wrote about sorcerers, not in firelit panic, but in careful Latin. They listed signs. They debated categories. They argued about intention. A woman who cursed her neighbour's crop with a whispered hex might be hanged. But a man who summoned a demon to answer a question about the stars, that required discussion. Class mattered. Education mattered. Wizards were harder to kill than witches, not because they were less feared, but because they were more connected. A baron might burn a healer to satisfy a crowd, but he'd consult the astrologer before signing the order. Some men dabbled in magic openly. John Dee in Elizabethan England called himself a mathematician, but kept a crystal for speaking with angels. Marsilio Ficino translated Plato and summoned spirits with hymns. Paracelsus mixed medicine with mysticism and called it chemistry. They were not burned, they were printed. But not all were lucky. Cornelius Agrippa, brilliant and careful, fled more than one country. Giordano Bruno was less lucky. He burned in 1600. Not because he made gold, but because he talked too much about infinity. Infinity was the real heresy. To say the stars go on forever, without edge, without hierarchy, was to unmake the world as the church had arranged it. No more celestial spheres, no more tidy layers of heaven, just endless space, and in that space, possibilities, too many possibilities. It was one thing to call on spirits, it was another to suggest that Earth was not the centre, that God's throne was not just beyond Saturn, that the universe had no throne at all. A wizard who made that claim was not only a magician, he was a threat to order itself. And so, Bruno burned. But most wizards kept quieter. They knew the line. Or tried to. They spoke in riddles. They disguised instructions as metaphors. A potion recipe might read like a poem. A summoning rite might be written as an allegory about birds. Secrets were encoded in layers. Symbol, colour, planetary hour. Gold was never just gold. Lead was never only base. To turn one into the other was not about metal. It was about the soul. Alchemy was the wizard's most famous art, and its most misunderstood. The alchemist was not trying to get rich, not the true ones anyway. He sought purification. The transmutation of matter was a mirror for the transmutation of self. Base lead becomes radiant gold only when the practitioner is likewise refined. His mind disciplined, his passions cooled, his thoughts turned upward. The process was long. Calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation. Each step mirrored in flame and bottle, and in the heart. The final product, the Philosopher's Stone, was not just a substance, it was a concept, a proof, that the world had a logic, that perfection could be reached, that the divine was not only above, but hidden within. Some claimed to find it, most did not. But they searched anyway. Because the world of the wizard was one of layers. Nothing was as it seemed. A herb was not only for taste, it had a temperament, a planetary affiliation, a place in the body's hidden map. A number was not just quantity, it carried meaning, vibration, essence. 7 was sacred, 12 was cosmic, 1 was divine, everything mattered, and this was the wizard's gift, and his burden. He lived in a world where nothing could be dismissed. A sign could be anything, a spider building its web in the east corner of your study, a candle that won't light at midnight, a drop of ink that falls just so on a page meant for calculation. The wizard lived in a world thick with symbols, saturated with the suspicion that meaning lurked behind every veil, waiting to be read properly. To be misread was dangerous, but to ignore was worse. And so he read. He read stars like others read scripture. He watched the moon as if it carried letters written only for him. He timed his experiments to planetary hours, not arbitrary, but rooted in ancient astrological doctrine. The hour of Saturn for banishing, the hour of Jupiter for growth, the hour of Mars best avoided unless blood must be drawn. Astrology was not superstition in this world, it was physics. The movement of stars did not suggest possibility, they governed it. A child born under a bad conjunction might grow cruel. A nation crowned during a waning moon might falter. The stars did not decide everything, but they decided enough. It was not deterministic, it was advisory. The wizard walked carefully between fate and free will, trusting in timing, planning his steps like chess. He wore rings set with stones that corresponded to certain virtues. He carved names, often in languages older than Latin, into candle wax, into bread crusts, into the wood beneath his desk. Sometimes he whispered things under his breath that no one else understood. These were not incantations in the fairy tale sense, no crackling fireballs, no dramatic transformations, but subtle nudges, alignments, adjustments, the right phrase at the right moment, like tuning an instrument that was almost in pitch. His spells were more often questions than commands. He did not demand, he invoked. To invoke meant to ask with precision, to know the name of the force you were speaking to, not its nickname, not its public face, but its true name. The wizards believed that everything had one. That language itself was a key to the universe, and that if you spoke the correct words, in the correct order, with the correct intention, the veil between the seen and unseen might just tremble. Not part, not fall, just tremble. That was enough. A moment of correspondence, a flicker of resonance between mind and matter. That was the wizard's miracle. Not changing the world, but hearing it speak. The wizard's reputation depended heavily on control, his and others' perception of it. He was respected only so long as his knowledge appeared contained. If he made predictions, and they came true, he was wise. If he made too many, he became dangerous. A known astrologer who warned a noble of bad omens might be granted patronage. If his warnings were too accurate, he might be suspected of causing the misfortune he predicted. The line between foresight and responsibility blurred easily. Wizards relied on patronage as much as fear. Few operated independently for long. Wealthy nobles, scholars, even kings kept them close, using their counsel to time marriages, wars and investments. But loyalty was conditional. A failed prophecy could mean dismissal. A rival whispering sorcerer into the right ear could mean imprisonment. Protection was as fragile as power. Their libraries were tools and liabilities. A wizard's collection often included treatises on medicine, astronomy, mathematics, safe knowledge, alongside forbidden texts. Books attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, to Solomon, to fictional Arab sages who never existed but whose names lent gravitas. Owning certain volumes, particularly in vernacular languages, could be interpreted as heresy. Wizards wrote in code, used Latin abbreviations, disguised magical diagrams as geometry. Every page was both shield and confession. Their tools, astrolabes, compasses, lenses, often came under suspicion. In towns unfamiliar with such instruments, they were seen not as devices, but relics of control. A magnifying glass could be mistaken for an eye of power. A lodestone could be labelled a cursed object. Foreign metals drew more suspicion than common ones. Mercury, essential to alchemical experiments, was both revered and feared. It healed, but poisoned. It symbolised transformation and danger alike. Education offered wizards a layer of legitimacy, but also isolation. Their knowledge often placed them apart from local communities. They were summoned in crisis, consulted in illness or famine, and then sent away again. They were spoken of with admiration and unease. Their presence was tolerated until it wasn't. One misstep, a failed cure, a sudden death nearby, and all their learning meant nothing. The church's attitude toward wizardry remained inconsistent. Ecclesiastical courts often distinguished between natural magic and necromancy. The former, rooted in herbalism, astrology, or learned texts, could be framed as part of God's creation. The latter, summoning spirits, commanding demons, was blasphemous, but the categories were flexible. A bishop's magician might be lauded for crafting a protective charm, while a village man doing the same was jailed. Wizards walked a narrow line. They needed to appear helpful, but not indispensable. Strange, but not monstrous. They survived by cultivating awe, avoiding envy, and knowing when to disappear. Those who failed to read the room, those who grew too bold or too successful, became the subjects of rumours first, accusations second, and trials third. Necromancy, in the medieval sense, did not mean raising skeletons from graves. It meant conjuring spirits, often of the dead, to gain knowledge. Wizards who practiced necromancy did not expect corpses to speak, but they did expect signs. A voice in the wind, a vision in smoke, a sudden chill. The rituals were complex and often deliberately obscure. Many were copied from older mistranslated texts. Circles were drawn with precise measurements. Names of angels and demons were inscribed. Sacrifices, typically of animals, sometimes symbolic, were used to bind the ritual. The goal was information about the future, about hidden truths, about enemies. This form of magic occupied the most dangerous territory. It borrowed heavily from Christian imagery. Psalms, crosses, saints' names, mixed with elements of Jewish mysticism and Islamic astronomy. Practitioners used this blend to shield themselves from accusations. But necromancy was never truly safe. It flirted too closely with heresy. To call up the dead was to trespass into divine jurisdiction. The church might tolerate astrology. It rarely forgave summoning. Yet the same scholars accused of necromancy laid the foundations for science. Roger Bacon, often rumoured to have magical powers, was a Franciscan friar who wrote on optics, chemistry, and mathematics. He used lenses to study light, experimented with gunpowder, and advocated for empirical methods. His reputation as a wizard came not from what he did, but from how he did it. Alone, methodically, ahead of his time. The unfamiliar always looks like sorcery. By the 17th century, the image of the wizard began to shift. Universities absorbed many of their disciplines. Astronomy replaced astrology, chemistry overtook alchemy. Medicine moved into hands trained by anatomy, not herbalism. The magician became obsolete, not by persecution, but by replacement. The language of magic was recast as outdated, irrational feminine. Male practitioners became scientists, female ones remained witches, but wizards never disappeared. They moved into stories. In fairy tales, they became advisors, wise old men with long beards and cryptic warnings. They wore robes, they carried staffs. They were safely distant from the world, and their power was no longer dangerous, it was decorative. Merlin, once a wild prophet and madman in early Welsh texts, became a courtly guardian in later retellings. The wizard was defanged, sentimentalised, and reimagined. Still, traces remain. Modern language keeps them. We speak of magic bullets, black boxes, wizards of finance and tech. We refer to charm, spellbinding, alchemical changes. The metaphors persist because the original figure remains haunting. The wizard represents the solitary mind, the one who sees the pattern others miss, who acts when others hesitate, who understands more than he is allowed to say, and so he lingers, in old books, in game manuals, in quiet references tucked into footnotes. Now what about warlocks? The word warlock is a strange one. Unlike wizard, which suggests wisdom, or magician, which implies mastery, warlock carries with it a hiss of betrayal. In its earliest uses, Scots Old English, it didn't mean male witch, it meant oathbreaker, a deceiver, Someone who had sworn one thing and done another. Someone who had betrayed trust and possibly the divine. Only later, centuries after the height of the witch hunts, did the word begin to describe a man who practiced forbidden magic. And even then, it was not a neutral term, it was sharp accusatory. A warlock wasn't just a practitioner of dark arts. He was someone who had turned from God, turned against his people, turned toward power that was never meant to be his. Unlike the cunning man or the philosopher alchemist, who might be consulted with caution, the warlock was feared outright, not for what he knew, but for what he'd abandoned. He was marked by transgression, by pact. The implication was always that a warlock had made a choice, and not a wise one. The warlock was thought to consort with demons, not merely summon them, to command spirits not as servants, but as allies. He had crossed a line, and worse, had chosen to stay there. In folklore, warlocks were often loners, rarely part of a coven, unlike the women accused of witchcraft. They were solitary, their power corruptive rather than communal. If a village spoke of a warlock, it was with suspicion layered on fear. He wasn't just dangerous, he was disloyal. He might curse the fields, cause animals to miscarry, poison wells, or he might do nothing at all, only be seen walking at dusk, coat unfastened, looking too long at the moon. In some tales he could not be killed by normal means. In others, he had already died and simply hadn't stayed that way. In practice, very few men were ever formally accused of being warlocks. More often, they were called wizards, magicians, conjurers. Warlock was a word used in stories, not courts. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, especially in the Carpathians and deep rural Transylvania, belief in magic persisted long after courts stopped prosecuting it. These weren't witches or wizards in the literary sense. They were called strigoi, stuhachi, vidiachi, seers, dreamers, fighters in their sleep. In some tales, they battled each other in dreams to determine whose village would get rain. Milk curdled not from sin, but because one of these spirit fighters had lost. Their magic was not ritual but role. A community assigned them this identity. They were treated with cautious respect. No trials, just distance. Records from Poland mention wind chasers, men who could steal your harvest by calling the wind to shake your grain loose and carry it elsewhere. In Scandinavia, some men were accused of cedar, a form of magic primarily practiced by women. Odin, they said, practiced it too, but he was mocked for it. It was effeminate. A man who worked in hidden knowledge risked being unmanned. The legal records are strange. Sometimes they read like fiction. One man in 16th century Geneva confessed, after prolonged questioning, to turning into a wolf and eating his own children. A miller in Bavaria claimed he rode to a witch's sabbath on a pitchfork after his cat whispered instructions. These confessions were not rooted in magic. They were made under pressure, under pain, under weeks without sleep. But they were believed. They were entered into record. They were archived. Some of them still sit in drawers, waiting. In folk magic, the difference between a spell and a blessing was often the accent. A woman who muttered over her bread to make it rise might be praying, or she might be enchanting. The difference was how well she was liked. Many communities had charmers, people who removed curses, healed warts, whispered over sheep. They used holy words, salt, iron nails. The same tools used to ward off witches were sometimes used by witches. If a charm worked, it was from God. If it failed, it was from the devil. Success was the danger. Animals weren't just familiars, they were evidence. A mouse found in your cupboard could be called an imp. A beetle in your firewood might be your assistant. A woman once kept a hedgehog that was believed to whisper Latin. Cats, of course, bore the brunt of it. Black cats were killed en masse in plague years, which only worsened the rats. The association of animals with magic wasn't purely superstitious. It was practical. Animals went where people didn't. They saw things no one else saw. The words used in magic mattered. Most magic in medieval Europe wasn't cast in rhymed verse. It was chanted, muttered, spoken half in Latin, half in regional dialect. Many incantations were palindromic or contained nonsense syllables. This wasn't to confuse the devil. It was to simulate power, language that sounded older, deeper, heavier than the listener could understand. Words were believed to do. The right syllable, pronounced correctly, could open doors. Tools varied. Some wizards used brass mirrors. Others carried staffs carved with symbols. A charmer might use a stone with a hole in it, called a hagstone, worn around the neck. A piece of red thread, knotted 9 times, could bind a spirit. A book was best of all, even if unreadable. Many were fake, blank pages or borrowed psalters with magical titles scratched onto the cover. The illusion of knowledge was often safer than the thing itself. And then there were frauds. Some pretended to power they didn't have. They sold amulets, promised love spells, offered weather charms for coin. They mimicked the real rituals, copying gestures and phrases. Some were caught and fined, others grew wealthy. The line between fraud and folk healer blurred, especially when people wanted to believe. When a drought stretched too long, even the skeptical turned to ritual. There were women who lived as wizards, passing as men. We know little about them. Their names don't survive, but occasional fragments hint at it. A legal case where he was found out to be she, and had been living as a travelling physician. Another where a widow took up her husband's healing practice, disguised, and was caught only when a patient gave birth to twins, and no one could agree who'd blessed them. Children were sometimes accused of witchcraft too. Rare, but it happened. A child with a strange birthmark, a boy who spoke too early, a girl who didn't cry when her mother died. They were rarely tried, but often shunned. Some were beaten, some were sent away. A few became known for gifts, divining rods, prophecy, cures, but most were forgotten. Some of them were kept hidden. Mothers who feared the whisper of witch blood learned to silence their children before the village could. They taught them not to speak of dreams, not to mention when the bread burned in their presence, not to sing to the animals, even if the animals came when called. The luckier ones grew quiet enough to pass unnoticed. The less lucky ended up in cellars, or convents, or in the woods behind a relative's house, known only to a few as the strange one. In rare cases they were used. A nobleman with an ill wife might call for a child rumoured to speak with angels. A merchant with too much gold and too few sons might pay a farmer to borrow the boy who never blinked at thunder. These children became tools, omens, proof that the world still contained mysteries. They were passed from hand to hand like relics, consulted, fed, forgotten. Sometimes they died young, sometimes they vanished, sometimes they grew up and remembered too much. There are accounts, half legends, half legal record, of children who wandered from village to village, selling visions. A girl with a braided rope, who would tie knots while she spoke, then leave it behind. A boy who refused to eat unless the moon was full. Their stories don't end in fire, as the stories of witches so often did. But they do end in silence. The records stop. The names trail off. It is likely that, eventually, the magic they embodied turned into suspicion, and suspicion into exile. The line between gifted and cursed was never wide, especially for those who had no one to argue on their behalf. In this way, the myth of childhood innocence is warped. The medieval world did not always see children as blank slates. Some were born with too much knowledge. Some were said to carry the memory of past lives. Others were marked at birth, in ways the midwife noted but did not speak of aloud. The mother might insist it was a bruise. The priest might insist it was a sign. No one asked the child. They learned if they survived to keep their eyes down, to hide what they knew. And when they grew old enough to leave, they often did. Their absence became its own kind of legend. The boy who talked to bees, the girl who never cried, the child with the too clear stare who left one morning and was never seen again. Those children, the ones who vanished, often returned only in stories, not as themselves, but as warnings. A caution sewn into lullabies or slipped between verses in market songs. A whisper that said, "Don't wander into the woods at dusk. Don't look too long into still water. Don't answer when someone calls your name from behind a hedge, especially if you're alone, especially if you're sure no one should be there." They became the creatures of borderlands. Not ghosts exactly, not demons either. Something in between. Something human once, but changed by too much attention. Or too little. The girl who could speak to stars became the woman who steals shadows. The boy who read dreams became the man who waits at crossroads, offering riddles instead of coins. Folklore has a long memory, but a poor sense of justice. It preserves the shape of a person, but not their truth. Witches became hags, wizards became tricksters. The children of strange fortune became monsters in the underbrush. Sometimes, though, just rarely enough to matter, the stories turned kindly. A wise woman in the forest who helps if you bring her rosemary. A silent man who mends broken tools with a single breath. The child in rags who appears when a fever won't break and vanishes again once it does. These weren't tales of fear. They were tales of second chances, of magic that survived long enough to become help instead of harm. But even these stories come with a warning. Never ask too many questions, never demand their name, and never try to follow them when they leave. Let us turn now to something more absurd. Animals, tried and punished for crimes, not metaphorically, not allegorically, but literally, dragged before judges, defended by lawyers, sentenced, and in some cases, executed. The Middle Ages were a place where law and superstition shared a common table, and no seat was more strangely occupied than that of the accused animal. Over the next few minutes, we will drift into the surreal reality of animal trials in medieval and early modern Europe. A history so quiet and bizarre, it feels like something dreamt. After a long day and a heavy meal, here we go. The first record is from 1266. A pig is hanged in Fontenay-aux-Roses, France, for killing a child. Not in self-defence, not in some desperate flailing, just killed. And so it is tried. It is brought to court, found guilty, and led to the gallows. A hood is placed over its head. The executioner solemnly performs his duty. It is not the only one. Pigs, in particular, are frequent defendants. They wander into homes, they bite, sometimes they maim, sometimes they kill. And people, unable to separate accident from omen, act accordingly. The pig is seized, a trial is held, witnesses are called, the beast stands in the dock, usually tied, sometimes dressed in a waistcoat. The judge speaks seriously. The sentence is passed, the pig is hanged. Sometimes it is excommunicated first, because the church must be seen to act. Animals in this context are not beasts. They are moral actors. They can sin. They can offend. They can be punished. And by punishing them, the community proves. It still understands the difference between justice and chaos. This was not satire. This was law. In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a sow was convicted of killing a child and sentenced to death. But this case went further than most. The pig was dressed in human clothing, a waistcoat breeches and gloves, and paraded through the square before being hanged. The purpose was not mockery, it was ritual. By dressing the animal as a man, the community underscored its belief that the pig had transgressed the moral order. It had crossed a line meant only for the soul-bearing, and so it was punished like a man. These trials were not rare curiosities. They persisted across Europe for centuries. In Switzerland, Germany and France especially, such prosecutions were conducted with full legal formalities. Judges, clerks, executioners, even defence attorneys. Men were appointed to speak on the animal's behalf. Arguments were made, precedents cited. Sometimes the animal was acquitted. Other times it was hanged, burned, or buried alive. In one case, a sow's piglets were also tried as accomplices, though they were found innocent. They had, the court concluded, simply followed their mother. Why go to such lengths? Because in the medieval worldview, disorder was more terrifying than absurdity. A pig that kills a child is not just dangerous, it is disruptive. It inverts the proper chain of creation. The human is meant to rule over beasts, not be destroyed by them. To leave such an act unpunished would invite more chaos, disease, blight, divine wrath. By holding a trial, the town reasserts its authority over the moral fabric of the world. But not all animals were punished for violence. Rats were tried for theft, specifically grain theft. In 15th century France, the ecclesiastical court of autumn summoned a colony of rats for devouring local crops. The rats, naturally, failed to appear. Their appointed defence counsel, a highly respected legal mind named Bartholomew Chassenet, argued on their behalf with full seriousness. He claimed the rats had not been properly summoned, that the summons was too narrowly posted, and that his clients could not safely travel to court due to the presence of cats along the route. The argument was absurd, but it was not a joke. Chassenet, who would go on to a distinguished legal career, treated the case with full decorum. He cited legal precedent. He invoked the rights of the accused. He appealed to both Roman law and canon law, insisting that his clients, though rodents, were entitled to a fair summons and safe passage. The court, constrained by its own procedures, could not simply dismiss him. To do so would risk unravelling the authority it had built over centuries. If the law applies to animals, it must apply fully, or not at all. So the judge deliberated, and in the end, the rats were excused, on technical grounds. The verdict was not an exoneration, it was a surrender to the limits of performative justice. The weevils would not leave the vineyards, the rats would not stop eating grain, but the trial had been held, and that mattered more than outcome. There was a strange dignity in it, or perhaps a desperation, a need to believe that even nature could be brought to heel through procedure, that the world, even in its smallest, most ridiculous breaches, could be made to answer. It was also, in a roundabout way, a trial of God. If creation misbehaves, who is ultimately responsible? Who made the weevil? Who gave the pig its teeth? Who designed a world in which the smallest thing could destroy a harvest or a child? These were not questions that could be asked aloud, so the community asked differently, indirectly, through trials. The medieval devil was not at first the figure we know today. He began not with horns and hooves, but with absence, a name muttered, a shadow in scripture, a reason for why good things fail. In early medieval Europe, he was less a villain than an explanation, a placeholder, the thing to blame when other things went wrong, a whisper that bridged the gap between what God permitted and what humans endured. But slowly, steadily, the devil took shape. Theologians gave him a biography. Once the most beautiful of angels, cast down from heaven for pride, now the master of a kingdom of inversion. Hell as the mirror of heaven, disorder as the mirror of divine order. Where God created, the devil corrupted. Where God loved, the devil twisted, and he became useful. To preachers, the devil was a narrative device, a way to make sin visible, a threat that explained why obedience mattered. His image evolved: bat wings instead of angel's feathers, goat legs, claws, a tongue like a snake. Not because people believed demons looked that way, but because they needed to believe he could. In art, he was sometimes grotesque, sometimes beautiful. Tempting, not because he was monstrous, but because he understood what you wanted and why. He whispered, not shouted. He waited, not pounced. The devil didn't need to act directly. He just needed to offer you the rope and let you hang yourself. For centuries, people believed he walked the earth subtly. A storm at the wrong time, a miscarriage, a toothache that led to fever. The devil worked through openings, through weakness, through doubt, through women who lived alone, through men who read too much, through animals who acted too human.